Well, good evening, everyone. Can we start this session of the Corporate Committee? So this is a resumed meeting from the committee meeting that was held on the 16th of November. We agreed to adjourn that meeting in order to have further consideration of the item we were discussing at the time, as well as to finish the agenda. As it's a resumed meeting from last week, I don't propose to go around the room for introductions, but we do have apologies from Councillor Emery and Councillor Rossetti, and I believe from Councillor Barnes as well, and Councillor Berriman sent apologies for lateness. So we were on item 11, which is the building, place and street name review. A further document was circulated today. So before we start, do members want 5 minutes to read the paper that was circulated today? Yes, okay. In that case, we will pause for 5 minutes to give members time to read through that, and then we will pick up the discussion. Thank you. Are members ready to resume? Yeah, so do you need? Okay, thank you. So at this point, I'll invite Charlotte Pomeroy to introduce the item.
Thank you, Councillor Mitchell, and good evening, members of the committee. I'm going to introduce this paper, which, apologies, it was circulated today, but it is a paper in response to the motion put forward at the committee meeting last week. So we respond to the motion in that we propose that the committee take forward the process for the renaming of Blackpool Lane, as suggested, in accordance though with the decision of the committee made on the 17th of March, and that provided for a further period of consultation be carried out to provide further assurances to residents of Blackpool Lane. And the rationale for that is that on the 18th of March, Blackpool Lane residents, businesses and community groups were advised of that decision of the March committee, and that therefore it is believed that residents would have rightly and legitimately expect a further period of consultation and consideration of that feedback before the committee proceeds to make a final decision. Those residents, business and community groups would have, we contend, had a legitimate expectation that the published report put before the committee on the 16th of November, so last Tuesday, would not lead straight to a final decision, and members and residents would have understood, having had that letter and having understood the March 2021 committee decision, that further consultation would be undertaken. So this paper recommends that a time-limited period of further consultation is undertaken. We've tried to allow as much time as possible for that consultation, bearing in mind a return to this committee on the 1st of February 2022, with a period to allow for any feedback to be considered meaningfully before a final decision paper is brought to committee. Further, we note that we need an executive view on funding the support package to residents, and that we would make sure that we've got that support package directly for those residents directly affected. A decision regarding that is made in that period between the end of the consultation on the 19th of January, when we'll better understand residents' views on that support package, but prior to the committee's decision making on the 1st of February. We will continue to prepare a report to Cabinet separately on the strategic framework on building, place and street renaming, that reimagining Haringey's public realm, which we discussed at the last committee meeting, and to ensure that as part of that process, we seek endorsement of a budget to be set aside to fund the support packages to be made available to those affected by a street naming in the future, should those be agreed in the future. I think just in terms of the timetable for implementation of any decision, in the event that on that 1st of February meeting, committee decides to make an order to change the name, just caution around the implementation date to ensure that does not cause any practical problems around electoral registration or cause any problems for the smooth running of the local government elections. This will need to be worked through in order that the committee can make an informed decision on any implementation timescale, and that's in light of the local government elections in place in May 2022. So this paper is put before you with a series of recommendations, and I'd ask committee to consider those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from members? Councillor Ibrahim.
So thank you, Charlotte, for your report, and I've read through the papers. My only question is, and I think you're right to point out that obviously the decision that this committee made on the 17th of March committed to further consultation. Why did that not happen?
I think we went into a period of a pre-election period, and then there was the follow through of a new cabinet and the follow through of still responding to the pandemic, and therefore it wasn't felt possible to take that forward at that time. And the conversations were also about the wider strategic framework that we presented last time, into which quite a lot of conversation had happened. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Ejiofor?
Thank you, Chair. I do have a question for Charlotte. I've got a couple of questions for the monitoring officer. If I do them separately. Charlotte, there was a mention in the paper that further financial decision from the executive is required, but there was a decision previously taken which put some money into this project. What happened to that money?
So this is just by way of ensuring that, subject to because of the further consultation, which might include a view on further support required as part of compensating residents, that we have sufficient funding to follow that through. So we didn't want to commit to something that we haven't set aside sufficient budget for. So we will just, in the event that we need to make a further decision, that's the reason for that being placed there, Councillor Ejiofor.
Right, Chair, can I just get clarity? So if there is no additional change to the financial package, then that budget is already agreed. Is that right?
So that, yeah, we'll still need to make an under-delegated decision, or through our executive will still need to make a decision to allocate that budget. But yes, it's there in the event that the package agreed is different from the package previously put before committee.
Okay, just to the monitoring officer, please. I'm trying to find out, because within the recommendations it talks about the period between the decision, whatever that decision might be, in February and implementation. Is there a minimum period of time between the signing, the agreement by committee to make an order and when that order can be implemented? Is there a minimum period of time? Also, obviously, this period of time comes into the time around pre-election period. All right. I might take the view that it's probably not the best time to do something which might be politically contentious. But is there anything stopping us doing it on the day after the election?
Can I hand over to, is it Stephen going to take that for the monitoring officer?
Thank you, Chair. Just to check that the committee can hear me. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Chair. Now, in terms of the query about whether or not there is a minimum period of time for implementation, and Councillor Ejiofor, I'm not aware of any such minimum period of time. But again, it's something which I'm happy to actually look into further. In terms of whether or not it's possible to actually have the decision implemented a day after the election, again, I think it is possible. But again, I think what I need to bear in mind is this: is that I'm not aware of the details on the implementation itself and the number of process that entails in terms of changing the street names, various notifications required. So practically, I'm not quite sure if that is possible, but it depends on whether or not those steps that needs to be taken to actually basically effect the name change has been undertaken.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Councillor Blake.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a couple of comments. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues, Councillor Amin and Councillor Tabwa, for illuminating some of the history, I think, particularly in relation to the pub, which Haringey isn't where I was brought up as a child. But that history, I think, made it for me even more perplexing in terms of the delays that we've had around this decision. And just coming to the points on the delays, I mean, clearly this hasn't been a political priority, and I'm glad to see that we're now stating very clearly that it is a political priority, because that's absolutely the right thing to do. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Amin.
And Charlotte, I'm so sorry.
It's the opposite from last time.
Okay. What shall I do? No bother.
Move it further away.
Okay.
That's better.
I have a colleague who does this all the time. A bit more mobile. I'm old, so I'm not so mobile. Charlotte, there's a couple of things I think, and now that I come to it, they've just gone out of my head with all this falafel. There's a couple of things. I don't know, when you were speaking, I don't know if I missed it, whether I missed the timescales for consultation, when it would begin and when it would end. Just so we're clear about that, that would be helpful. And also, you talked about the payment to residents and the inconvenience it would cause them. I just wondered whether we're going to earmark it, benchmark it with other authorities, because there's lots of other, I mean, there are so many authorities that have done this without this kind of problem, where authorities have just got on with it and nobody has had a difficulty with it. But, you know, if that's the case, if we are going to ask and look at costs, then can we please benchmark it with other authorities, because otherwise it feels we're just pulling figures out of the air for people, and I think that's, from my perspective, doesn't sound very right thing to do.
Are you able to help on that, Charlotte?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Amin, for the questions. So first, the period of consultation will start from the 1st of December to the 19th of January. That's designed to allow us as much time as possible, while still having time to return to the 1st of February committee, and recognising that Christmas and New Year fall in between. So that's the consultation period. On the second issue of the support package, so the proposals for the support package were built up by looking at the administrative tasks that a resident might be required to make in terms of changing the name, and a package was built up out of those costs. We can certainly go and look at those again and consider whether in comparison with other authorities that is considered an appropriate amount. It's fair to say that the March committee asked that we reviewed that support package as part of the consultation work, so that's the process we'll do, and we certainly can take into account any other authorities that have gone through a similar process.
Yes.
I mean, I have to say, I would prefer us not to pull figures out of the air, because that's what other people or other councillors are asking for. I would much prefer we benchmark the actual costs rather than kind of give more or less or whatever it is. You know, it just feels too personal in the way we're dealing with it at the moment. I would rather we just had a proper figure, and this is the cost, you know, this is the support package, and be very fair with it but straightforward about it. Otherwise we are being pushed to give more, and I you know, just the whole thing already is, there's a bad taste in my mouth about this whole process, and the last thing I would want to do is to further damage I don't know, to have a further impact of all of that continuing in that kind of uncertain way.
Thank you. I think from the March committee papers, there was quite a detailed breakdown or build up, depending which way around you look at it, of the costs of the support package based on assessing the costs of changing all the details that might need to be changed, the subscription changes, those sorts of things. So we did. I can assure you, Councillor, it wasn't figures plucked out of the air, but I equally undertake that we will benchmark with other authorities who've gone through a similar process.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Dogan, Councillor Demir afterwards.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Charlotte, for your report. Just a couple of points. So in relation to consultation, so during the time in March, it was much more difficult in terms of reaching out to the residents. So could you give us some sort of view that it will be actual, and if it's necessary, virtual too, so you can reach out to many residents as possible? And in terms of the financial package, so I think it's important that residents feel reassured any additional cost will be covered by the council. So I will appreciate those points are considered. Thank
you, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor Durgan. On the first point, yes, I think it is an opportunity, given we're through the worst phases of the pandemic, to do more face-to-face work, to look at different ways of consulting with residents of Blackberry Lane, and that's the cohort we'll be consulting with. So absolutely, that this is an opportunity that we wouldn't have had we undertaken this earlier in the year. On the second point, I think we will need, as a local authority, to take a view on the appropriate level of the package, and that's got to be, as Councillor Amin was saying, fair and equitable for all residents affected. So I think we will do that more detailed work again, make sure the costs that we've taken into account are the appropriate ones, and return to committee for the 1st of February so they can make an informed decision on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Demir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Charlotte. Chair, I was at the meeting on March when there was a motion that decided to extend the consultation period. Now, I understand that part of the main reasons for extension was because of the lockdown. It was difficult to do door knocking. We haven't been in lockdown, more or less, or, lockdown has eased significantly since June. So that's about, 5-6 months since then. And if I remember the motion correctly, and the topic then, it wasn't to come up with a strategic framework for reimagining public realms, which is good in the long term, but that was not the topic of discussion. So I have to say, as I said, before in March, that this does feel a bit like kicking the can down the road again, or kicking it onto the long grass. So I'd just like to understand what happened between easing of the lockdown, because that was one of the primary reasons for, aside from the payments issue, but the primary reasons for extending a legal consultation that had taken place. So nothing has happened since then. And last week when we came here, there was no mention of any kind of consultation plans for Blackpool Lane, which is part of the reasons why we were here. So this is the 3rd meeting that I'm in, which has been extended for another one, and I suspect there will be many more for something that is, I suppose, for me anyway, a moral right that we have to correct. Thank you.
Well, of course, there are various reasons, as has been mentioned, as to why that consultation didn't take place. I mean, we are where we are, but what is now being proposed is that that consultation should take place. I don't know if, Charlotte, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that sums it up. I mean, that is the consultation we are proposing would take place now, which is the expectation of local residents. We will separately, as indicated, take forward the work on the strategic framework, and that's the proposal before you tonight.
Councillor Ejiofor.
Thank you again, Chair. 1 for the monitoring officer and 3 to Charlotte. Whichever monitoring officer we've got on duty today, I think that might be Stephen. Can you confirm that legally the council is not obliged to make any payment whatsoever to residents, and that the payment plan that is agreed is effectively an ex gratia payment, because we are seeking to assist residents through this change period, though, however, legally this is not required. Can you confirm that, please?
Stephen, are you able to help on that?
Chair, that is indeed correct. There is no statutory requirement for us to pay any compensation or provide a support package to residents. That's correct, Chair.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The other 3 are to Charlotte on this report. Firstly, just reading through the report that we've got, there are no equality statements in this report. Why isn't there an equality statement in the report when effectively one of the principal reasons why we're renaming Blackboy Lane is because it is seeking to address discrimination? There's another one there where we are not currently in lockdown. What happens when we return to lockdown in early January? Is this then going to be another reason to delay bringing this as a report to committee in February, or can we get the start of the consultation done immediately? And finally, this report mentions several times the strategic framework for reimagining Haringey's public realm. What likelihood is there that this framework will be in any way successful if this local authority, if Haringey as a council cannot rename Black Boy Lane?
I wasn't aware we were moving into lockdown in January. What was the basis of that? Okay. So there was an equalities impact assessment with the papers presented in March. So presumably that still applies, since we're now proposing to engage on that same issue. But Charlotte, is there any?
Yeah, that's correct. So this report was a report responding to your motion, Councillor Ejiofor, and therefore just picked up the legal and financial issues. The equalities impact still stands, and the equalities comments from the report from last week still stand too. On the second point on lockdown, like as the chair indicated, I'm not aware of lockdown in January. Certainly, if that comes to pass, we are intending to start consultation from the 1st of December, mindful of how quickly things can change and have already changed in this pandemic. We would seek to do any face-to-face work at the earliest opportunity. We have to hope that lockdown does not occur, but it should not be a reason for preventing it once it's started. And the third point on the strategic framework is that we are separating out the proposal for Black Boy Lane as was proposed in the motion, so that we take forward the strategic framework, which would allow us potentially to look at other street names, to look at the identities in the public realm, to look at any street art and public art that we needed to in the borough, but to separately take forward the renaming process as is set out here. Thanks.
Councillor Ibrahim and then Councillor Amin.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, obviously, you're probably going to want to bring Councillor Amin in first, but I'm just conscious that because I'm aware, because a resident contacted me regarding the fact that a deputation, they attempted to bring a deputation to this committee on the issue, which was refused. And one of the ward councillors, Councillor Tucker, has had his hand raised for quite some time now. Will he be given the opportunity to ask questions?
Yes, I will do. I'll bring him in after Councillor Amin.
With the equalities statement. Charlotte, I was just going to say, with the equality statement, can we see it, please? Because we weren't here in March. So without the equality statement, and Councillor Ejiofor is right, we don't have the full picture or the full assessment that the officers made.
Yes, of course, we could circulate that. Yeah.
Or you can read it to us, perhaps?
I don't think it can be done. That's
gone. Is it?
Well, it's available online for anybody to look up.
Yeah, there's a full equalities impact assessment which was carried out. There were equality comments to the report in March also. Yeah,
it just feels wrong to continue, which is I've had an issue about this, to continue papers from the past when you weren't there with those original papers. So it feels like information that other people might have received, but we haven't received it in the same way. I can only depend on the minutes and stuff. So I just wondered, because, and it's actually quite an important thing. I want to see what you thought in your assessment of the equalities impact. So it just feels a bit imbalanced.
Well, I'm just puzzled by the questioning, since last week a number of members wanted to proceed there and then. Okay, Councillor Ibrahim then.
So my understanding is, from what Charlotte is saying, and from what that there was an equality impact assessment in the report last week.
There were equality comments
Was there
on
not?
the report. There were equality comments on the report last week. The report that proposed the renaming.
Equality comments.
The report that proposed the renaming.
Because it's a continuation, then.
Charlotte, had you finished? Sorry.
Yes, sorry, Councillor Ibrahim, to be talking. There's a little bit of lag, I think, on the feed, but yeah. So the report last week had equality comments, and this report was the report in front of you today is a response to the motion on the narrow legal and finance points on the equality impact assessment accompanied the March committee paper proposing renaming.
Thank you. Can I bring in Councillor Tucker, who I believe wants to ask a question?
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to make some points, actually, if you'll allow me to do so, Chair.
Are you speaking as a local ward councillor?
I certainly am.
Okay, go ahead.
Chair and colleagues, obviously, for the second time, for technical reasons, a deputation from Stand Up to Racism has been refused to this committee, which is a big pity because they've got very important things to say. But I have seen the statement which they put in, and I think they put their finger on something very, very worrying. And that's got two parts. And firstly is that delay after delay, and that's the tactic which is being used to prevent this necessary change, is being used instead of outright opposition. So instead of taking a principled but wrong stand and saying we don't want this change to be made, there are delays, obfuscations and reasons given for now is not the time, that there's another problem we've got to solve, etc. And the thing never happens. And unfortunately, the report presented to today's committee does exactly the same. They point out something as well, which is equally worrying, which is in Haringey, with the current political leadership we have, these delays and the actual opposition to the name change is coming right from the top. And they've identified the leader and the deputy leader as being the main part of the blockage to this change of name. And my worry is if this committee tonight gives allows another delay, all that will happen is that more reasons will be thought up between now and February in order not to do it. The question has been asked, why wasn't the decision of the wrong decision, mind you, but the decision of the March committee carried out? Why was the specific consultation with Blackpool Lane residents to win them over for the position of the name change? Why wasn't that carried out? A number of basically excuses have been put forward. The real reason, and that was absolutely clear from the report from the leader presented to the last meeting and the views from the deputy leader, which were presented directly to the last meeting, is that basically they don't want to carry it out, and therefore
Councillor Tucker, can I just ask you,
was completely
please,
frustrated.
Councillor Tucker, if you could just pause a moment. I don't think it's appropriate that you are criticising other members of the council who are not here and able to respond to those points. The document sets out very clearly why we are proposing a further period of consultation, which is because the residents of the road were given to expect that there would be further consultation. They were sent a letter.
If that was the case,
that's why we need to do that.
Chair, if that was the case, why did the report presented to last week's committee make no mention whatsoever of this specific consultation with Blackpool Lane residents? If it's a legitimate expectation, which they had from the March meeting, one, why in all these months has that not been carried out? And two, why in the report to the last committee was there no proposal whatsoever? Instead, there was a labyrinthine set of processes, bodies, long-winded words, etc., designed to kick it into the very, very, very long grass. Colleagues, my view is if the decision isn't taken today, It will just be an opportunity from the political leadership of Haringey Council to prevent this absolutely necessary change taking place, and that would be such a shame for our entire borough.
Thank you very much. The paper that was presented to the committee last week did point out that the March committee had called for further consultation, and we're here now in view of the comments that were made at that last meeting. So if there are no further questions from the committee, I suggest we move to the recommendations in the supplementary paper. So these are set out in section 2 on page 5 of the paper. Those recommendations are that officers take forward the decision of the committee made on the 17th of March 2021 to undertake a further period of consultation with Black Boy Lane residents, to commence on the 1st of December, close on the 19th of January 2022, and a report on the outcome of the consultation to be brought back to the committee on the 1st of February 2022 for a final decision on the making of an order to rename Black Boy Lane, and further for a decision on the implementation timetable such that it does not affect the preparation for and the conduct of the May 2022 local elections, in particular with regard to voter registrations. And 213, in view of those recommendations, propose that the committee amends its resolution to agree in principle the proposal made by Councillor Ejiofor, so as to permit further consultation with residents and a report back to the committee before a final decision is made to rename Black Boy Lane, and as set out in Appendix 1 to the report, which is on page 7. And we're further recommended that we note that after the close of further consultation, an executive decision will be sought to fund the proposed package of support to be offered to residents in the event of an order being made. And we're also asked to note that the Council is developing a strategic framework for reimagining Haringey's public realm, and that a report will be made to Cabinet on this in due course, including funding to be made available for any future street renaming. So there are some questions on that. Are there, Councillor Amin?
Councillor Mitchell, just a clarification, please. It is recommended that the committee note that after close of further consultation, an executive decision be sought to fund the proposed package of support to be offered to residents in the event of an order of the committee. I thought that package of support had already been identified. For the paper to have come to committee, I thought that was all identified already. So it's really, if it's further support, then it's a further package, as it were. But am I getting that right? Or
I believe that is the case, that money was identified in March. So perhaps Charlotte could clarify. I think this is referring to the possibility that we may wish to amend that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Mitchell. As in response to Councillor Ejiofor's earlier question, it is in the event that further, with the benchmarking that you've identified, Councillor, I mean, for example, with the further work with residents as part of the consultation with the review of the support package, if further funding is required.
the wording should be looked at, please, Charlotte, because it should say in the event of to fund the proposed package, or sought to fund further fund the package or something. Do you know, the wording doesn't seem right to me at the moment. Am I wrong? You can tell me if I'm wrong.
I think we wanted to leave open the opportunity, so just so there's a clear resource allocation for this in the event that what is there is not sufficient to cover it.
So, Councillor Blake, you had a query?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. No, it was just a proposal to the committee following Councillor Tucker's the points raised by Councillor Tucker. I just wondered if I mean, I think it'd be a gesture of goodwill if we could extend an invitation to Haringey Stand Up to Racism to come to the February meeting. Just put that as a proposal to the committee.
I'll second that.
Well, presumably it's up to them to make a request? Can I just?
Yes, it's part of the standing orders. They can put forward a deputation, provided they do that 3 clear working days before the meeting. So at the end of mid-January, they can contact us.
I don't know. Did Councillor Tabwa have your hand up?
Thanks, Chair. Right, so I'm reading through all the recommendations and everything, but Chair, I'm going to ask you or the monitoring officer, whoever it's easiest for, can you tell me what's changed between March of 21 to now? Because to me, it just seems like we're going to do exactly what you said you was going to do in March again. And if that's the case, as far as I'm concerned, we may as well actually put Councillor Ejiofor's motion to the vote, because I don't see what's changed. I don't see, there doesn't seem to be more money in the budget. It doesn't seem to be anything different here.
Sorry, I thought we had concluded the discussion on what is in the paper. So we adjourned last week in order to get comments from legal and finance. We now have those comments, and one point that is made is that there is an expectation amongst residents that there would be further consultation, because they were informed of that after the March meeting, and therefore that's why the course of action that's set out in this paper is proposed. So, Councillor Ejiofor, did you want to come back on this as well?
Couple of things. The consultation, the additional consultation is only part of the overall proposal, because obviously there's been consultation with residents across the borough, other interested parties. So it's not that this consultation alone is going to form the backbone of any new report. It is part of the overall report that comes back. Just to clarify that that's where we are with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry. The request for further consultation from the March committee has given residents a reasonable expectation or a legitimate expectation that further consultation will be carried out. It doesn't detract from the consultation previously carried out, which is in addition, as you point out, Councillor Ejiofor.
Okay. Councillor Ibrahim.
And sorry, the other thing was, again, I did ask Stephen about timing. If we make an order to do this thing in February, about the timing that is necessary, because it again talks about the issues around the timeframes. I think it's really important that we get to understand that the expectation of this committee would be that if the consultation comes back, and if when the committee weighs both sides of the argument fairly, as I'm sure that it will, that we are given the opportunity to make that order as soon as possible, for a date for a change as soon as possible.
Stephen, you wanted to come in on that?
Yes, Chair. Chair, I was going to comment on the earlier point about what has changed since the last meeting. Just to emphasise the point, again, it's clearly set out in the legal comments, and that position in the legal comments is also endorsed by the monitoring officer as well. What the council has done is that there have been a number of representations made to residents following the previous March decision that there was going to be further consultation. There was a letter written to residents. There was a press statement issued as well. In addition, if you go onto the council's, if you go onto the website on Black Boy Lane, there's also a clear statement there indicating that there is going to be further engagement with residents. Having made those clear representations, it is extremely unfair for the council now to decide to actually proceed to actually make a decision on the renaming without first giving the benefit to residents of that further consultation. That is what has changed. It is a fundamental point. It makes if the committee decides, for example, to actually proceed to make a decision to actually change the name tonight, then we are in very difficult legal territory. There is a potential for a claim being made against the council based on the principle of legitimate expectation. So I think I just want the committee members to be very clear on that point. In terms of on the implementation point, Chair, I think the way the recommendation has been crafted is so that when the report comes back to the committee in February, hopefully we should have a bit more information about the implementation in the event that the committee decides to actually proceed to make an order to change the name. We should have a bit more information about the likely implementation timetable, and hopefully that should actually enable the committee to actually make an informed decision as to when the order should actually take effect.
Thank you. Councillor.
Sorry, Chair, could I just get that written into the proposal about the implementation timetable? Because that was the point that I was making, that I don't want us to get into a situation where we're not given sufficient advice about when we can actually do this. And let's just say that there's an issue with some of the consultation in the new year. I don't want us to come back in February to have this decision delayed. So what I'd like to do is when the time comes, just add one line at the end of that recommendation, please.
Paragraph 212 already commits to a report back to the committee on the 1st of February, that would include a decision on the implementation timetable. So I'm not clear what more you want to add.
So, Chair, I'm looking for prior guidance on what that timetable might look like. So if there's an issue, for example, doing this thing during pre-election period, if there's a minimum time frame that needs to be done, needs to be delivered in order for the practicalities around that, I'd just like to know in advance rather than at the meeting, please, Chair.
Okay, Councillor Ibrahim, yeah.
So I'm actually more confused now than I was earlier on, at which point I was clear that it was to do with the fact that a commitment had been made, which I do accept is legitimate, that residents would expect that further consultation. Now, on the one hand, we've had advice to say that this committee can decide to make a renaming order, and that would be legal and that would be legitimate, which I believe was clarified earlier, so that there is no legal obligation to do a further consultation. But now we've had slightly varying advice, which says that, following Councillor Tabwar's question, that if we didn't do that consultation, we would be subject to legal challenge. So that's conflicting in my view. That's conflicting and confusing information, because if there is no legal obligation to do a further consultation, and if what you're saying essentially is that this committee, for all intents and purpose for the coming years, is tied to a decision that was made by a previous committee in a previous municipal year, then that's concerning, because what's become crystal clear is that a change in, as Charlotte pointed out, a change in the makeup of the executive did lead to the decision of a previous decision maker not being tied to. So therefore, you know, whether it was a decision that was actively taken or whether it was to, you know, make it broader as part of a broader review is neither here nor there in reality, when effectively what a subsequent decision maker made was not to pursue that consultation. So that was a change in a previous decision. So please advise me, why would it therefore not be legitimate for this committee to change a decision that was made on March the 17th? Or make a further decision that would contradict it, because it's become far more confusing than I thought when I initially read the recommendations.
I'm not clear on your confusion, to be honest.
I'm very clear, Councillor Mitchell. Can I be clear?
Can
because I don't appreciate being informed by the chair that I've not been clear. I've been crystal clear.
Thank
We've
you.
been
Can I
given
just refer you to
conflicting
the
legal information, and I would
paragraphs?
like clarity on that. So
Thank
please,
you.
could we conduct ourselves
Councillor
in a way
Ibrahim,
that
please,
respects
can you let
each
us have a
other's
reply?
perspectives? I've been very clear, and I don't appreciate being informed that I've not been.
Thank you. Stephen, do you want to come back on that?
Councillor Amin, thank you for that question. That
was Councillor Ibrahim.
Sorry, Councillor Ibrahim. My apologies, Councillor Ibrahim. Now, the legal advice in before the committee is very clear, and the legal principle is very clear on this. Once a public authority such as the council has made a very clear promise about to take a particular course of action, if the council renege on that promise, then the council can easily be judicially reviewed, and that is the basis of the principle of legitimate expectation, that fairness demands that you actually act on that promise, and you embark on the conduct which you've actually promised. I've made it very clear to the committee, Councillor Ibrahim, that the council, in its letter to residents, clearly stated that there is going to be a further period of engagement or consultation. Also, there is a press statement. Also, on the Blackpool Lane webpage, there is a clear statement in there that there is going to be further engagement. It is a clear promise. In those circumstances, the council must act on that promise. So there is a clear legal obligation on the council to actually engage in further consultation. I've made it also very clear in the legal comments section that if the council decides to proceed and make a decision tonight to make the order to rename Blackboy Lane, we are in difficult legal territory. The council is easily susceptible to a successful judicial review challenge, and also the council is also acting unlawfully. That position also has been endorsed by the council's monitoring officer. So my clear advice to the committee is this: you act in accordance with your previous decision and in accordance with what you've previously indicated, that there is going to be a further period of engagement. That is what the residents expect, and it is a right and legitimate expectation.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ibrahim.
Thank you, and that's made it clear, because it conflicted with an answer that was given earlier, or appeared to conflict, whereby we were told that we could make the decision, and that's what caused the confusion, and that's why I believe I was absolutely clear. So if you're saying that on the one hand we could do it, but on the other hand, if we did do it, we would be in legal jeopardy, is I suppose the right word to use, which is pretty straightforward, and putting it in simple terms. So what I would say is that I would like it noted that whilst there would be residents who would be opposed to the name changing, that would legitimately expect a further consultation, and we are obviously, I suggest that we should appreciate that, and we should and that we should adhere to that. At the same time, what I would also say is that there would be residents who and organisations like Stand Up to Racism, who also would have legitimately expected that consultation to have taken place, so that they could further the arguments for that name change. So on all counts, actually, I think it's absolutely clear that we should put on, that we should know as a committee that it is disappointing that that we ended up in a situation where we've had to have 2 protracted meetings and discussions on this issue, where actually on the 17th of March a decision was made to go out to consultation, and that did not happen. And I don't think that we should be here, but we are here, and I don't think that this committee should lose the opportunity to say absolutely clear that whilst we must always make sure that any decision we make does not put the council in jeopardy, we should also make sure that when decisions are made, like the one that was made on the 17th of March, that they should be implemented.
Right. We have the recommendations before us. Are we able to agree those recommendations set out on page 5 in section 2 of the report? Yes.
Agreed.
Do we need a show of hands on this? Everyone agreed? That's agreed unanimously. Right. Sorry, now I've got further hands. I thought, can we not move on? Councillor Amin?
Yeah, I wanted to move on, that's fine. But I wanted to move on, maybe, and we can bring it at any other business. I wanted to move on to discuss, at the end of the meeting, if you like, whichever you prefer, the way people behaved at the meeting we had last week, and some of the behaviour I'd like to look at along of other councillors. So I would, and I don't know whether this is the right point in the meeting, but I do want to look at that because some of the behaviour was very offensive and quite upsetting actually. So I wanted to pick that up with you to see whether you're going to be picking that behaviour up as well.
Well, I think the points you raise are possibly matters for standards rather than here, but I do hope that we can have discussions. Just a moment, we can have discussions and treat each other with respect and recognise and remember that this is a meeting held in public. I really want to move on. We spent a lot of time on this issue last week and we had to adjourn and resume, and we've spent over an hour already. We have just agreed the way forward. So please, can we do that? Councillor Blake, what point do you wish to raise?
Sorry, Chair, just very briefly, just coming back on the point, I accept that we cannot extend an invitation to Haringey Stand Up to Racism, but can we note it in the minutes that we would welcome them to approach the committee to come to the February meeting? Thank you.
Indeed, I'm sure we will consider any requests we receive for deputations, but this one was not made within the timescale. Councillor Ibrahim?
I'd like to follow up on the point that Councillor Amin made, actually, because I found some of that behaviour deeply distressing, and I think it's really, really important that when meetings are held in public, whether they're in private, that everybody treats each other with respect, that we don't make observations about each other's comments, and that we allow each person to speak in a way which, and on the subject, both clearly without interrupting each other, and also, making sure that just because, we're participating in meetings via technology, that we conduct ourselves in a way in which we would normally expect ourselves to conduct ourselves in a meeting. And I think it's really, really important that that be noted. I can obviously hear discussions going on at the moment, but yeah, that's my perspective.
Thank you. I really think we need to move on. If people have got just a moment, if people have got individual complaints about party colleagues, then the option of going to the Chief Whip is another avenue. But really, I don't want to prolong the discussion now. No, we really need to move on. Very quickly, Councillor Amin.
Right. I mean, the reason I raised it was your comment that we should treat each other with respect. And I feel I didn't feel I was particularly treated with respect last week, and I thought you would pick that up with your colleagues, actually, as the chair of the meeting. And you're not listening. Even now, you're still making every effort to not hear my point. If that's how you're going to conduct yourself, you carry on.
Right. Can we do? No, I'm going to draw a line under this. Apologies, Councillor Mead. No, I was listening to your point. I was looking at the correct paper for moving on with the agenda, because there are other people, I'm sure, watching online who want to get to the item.
Can I make a
Can you not
point,
interrupt,
please?
Councillor Ibrahim?
I've had my hand raised.
One brief point.
I'll be as extensive as is appropriate. I think we have to accept that it is the responsibility of the meeting and the responsibility of the chair to conduct a meeting in a way in which all colleagues feel safe and comfortable. And last week, I do not believe that happened. And, you know, ultimately,
thank you. I think the point has been noted. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can we move on to item 12, which is the decision making for the acquisition of Alexandra House, and this is the open part of the meeting. I will invite Minesh Jani to introduce the item, but just to be clear about how we're going to conduct this part of the meeting, all questions should be addressed through the chair, and these should be directed at officers and based on the information that's in the report, and those questions need to be in accordance with the remit of the committee. There should not be questions directed at other members of the committee about this report, and that's in line with the monitoring officer's advice, and also the point made about the distinction between which issues go to overview and scrutiny and which come to this committee, and this committee's role is to consider the process by which decisions were made in relation to Alexandra House. So can I invite Minesh Jani to introduce the item? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So by way of a quick background, a summary of the findings for Alexandra House were presented to the Corporate Committee back in March, but I'll reiterate the key issues identified. On this occasion, you have the full Mazars report, which sets out their findings. So the key highlights. We commissioned Mazars to investigate and report on the process by which a decision was taken not to purchase Alexandra House. The purpose of the investigation was to examine the governance arrangements in place for considering the opportunity to purchase Alex House and whether council policies and procedures were followed. As part of this investigation, Mazars examined reports and documents presented at the Corporate Property Board and the Strategic Property Board and the minutes from those meetings and the decisions that came from those meetings. They also used information provided by the Assistant Director, the Interim Assistant Director for Capital and Projects, who carried out her own investigation into what had happened. It's important to note for this committee that the investigation did not consider or give a view on whether Alexandra House should have been acquired or comment on its fair value. And that's predominantly because, as the chair set out, the role of this committee is around three specific factors from an internal audit perspective, around the governance, around the internal control environment, and around the management of risk, which all concern the process by which matters of the council business are dealt with. So from the review, it was noted that there appeared to be some options considered as to the reasons to acquire Alex House. Notably, that the purchase may help with the medium-term financial strategy savings and possibly help with the accommodation strategy. Though it's important to note that the accommodation strategy itself was pretty much in its infancy. And there seemed to be an assumption, the auditors note, that if the council didn't procure Alex House, that they would be able to continue to lease the building from whoever did buy Alex House. The key finding from the review from Azars was that the governance arrangements to manage acquisition of such significance, such as Alex House, were weak, and that's what was reported at the March meeting. The auditors commented that this essentially led to an ad hoc and largely informal process being adopted and a failure to raise matters at the appropriate fora and with appropriate officers and members in the right way and at the right time. It was further noted that there was also a lack of documentary evidence as to who was involved and what decisions were being made at appropriate intervals. There was no evidence that all options that could have been considered or should have been considered had been considered within any established framework, and there was an absence of a thorough business case which would have given decision makers an opportunity to examine the acquisition or otherwise in its fullness. So the investigation essentially highlighted the following key issues: lack of documented governance framework leading to decisions being made at inappropriate levels, and failure to consider all possible options as part of a comprehensive business case to consider the opportunity presented by looking at Alex House, acquiring or otherwise. No obvious forum for consideration of such matters within the terms of reference. A lack of formal reporting of options leading to formal decisions on how the opportunity was being progressed. Lack of clear delegation to determine who was the decision maker and who owned the decision, and then failure to formally record decisions and discussions in sufficient detail. In response to that, officers highlighted improvements that they'd wish to make, and they set out quite a few there. The key ones were there would be an acquisition and disposal policy, which was agreed by Cabinet as part of an asset management plan, and that was in February 2020. With an update scheduled for February 2021, following transparency about principles and tests applied for any acquisition proposals. Management also undertook to carry out a review of governance with principles of corporate property approach agreed at the Statutory Functions Board. Management agreed to make changes to the senior reporting arrangements which cover acquisitions, and that to be considered by a capital board. Improved formalised communication with Cabinet lead member and the leader about property matters through a property one-to-one and strategic property board, including acquisitions which are not recommended, with appropriate officer clearance in place and these to be properly minuted. The need for a formal developed tracker within the strategic property unit as a central register of all possible or agreed acquisitions in one place. And finally, a proper procedure for acquisitions and disposals, and for that to be reviewed and improved. Off the back of that, internal audit agreed that there would be a further review of the arrangements put in place for considering acquisitions going forward. I'll take questions.
Thank you very much. So I now invite any questions on the public reports, and discussion on the exempt reports will be in the exempt session later, as we agreed in September. So got Councillor Ejiofor.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I have to say that the several times that I've seen this particular report, I've always been upset about some particular nuances within it. It makes it appear that that councillors at the time were passengers, having not been aware that there was a problem, and it was officers that sort of popped up and solved the issue and solved the problem. I think that's completely inappropriate. The issue around, for example, the project tracker, the central register of all potential purchases and sales, was something was specifically requested by the cabinet at the time, and officers were tasked to do it rather than sort of waking up one morning and think this is a damn good idea. And I do think that is one of those things that doesn't come through this report at all. furthermore, the formal acquisitions and disposals policy was a specific request made by the leader at the time of the chief exec at the time, and that doesn't in any way, shape or form come through this report. It just makes it seem like that members were passengers and officers were riding forward to save the day. And obviously we're all a team, we work closely as a team, and the issues that were raised with regards to the problems initially were things that we had not foreseen. All right, but again, one of the principal criticisms made by the media and by councillors seeking to create problems were that senior people, whether they be the chief exec or the leader of the council, were given the opportunity to purchase, were aware of the opportunity to purchase Alex House. Can you confirm whether there was any evidence whatsoever that either the chief executive or the leader at the time were ever informed that the property was available to buy?
Thank you, Chair. Coming to your first point, from an administration point of view, internal audit will hold officers accountable for the governance they set up to manage their affairs. It is key officers that we hold to account for making sure their processes are adequate. And in this report, what the Mazars have highlighted is that those processes and procedures were not adequate. We're pleased to note that there is an intention to improve. We haven't tested those controls yet, and I'll bring a further paper to this committee once we have carried out that work. However persuaded they were to make those changes, but by no means does this report try to show or paint a picture which is one of officers having pulled the rabbit out of the hat or made the improvements and members not being involved. That is not the point. The reason I say that is because essentially the accountability for making sure the processes operate properly rests solely with officers, nobody else. And so that's the first point. Second point, I think there were, in terms of awareness, Mazars found absolutely no evidence that the chief executive or the leader at the time were aware of the decision not to purchase Alex House. There were some inferences, some incidental references in a couple of documents that seemed to indicate that there were options available around what the purchase of Alex House could do, but there was nothing that set out in a properly structured way what the officer advice should be or what opportunities existed. In my view, and I base this on the report that I've read from Mazars, it's very clear that for any decision maker to be in a position to be able to make a proper decision, they need to have proper facts, and that includes consideration from a number of different ways, and that just didn't exist.
Councillor Ashford?
Just on the specific point, is there any evidence that the chief executive or the leader were aware that the property was available to buy? It's not about what in a perfect world we might do with this building or we might do with that building. Is there, because the report shows that officers were pinging around emails for several months about, we can buy this and we might want to value it at that. There were lots of emails going around at a lower level. Is there any evidence that the fact that the building was available to purchase ever permeated its way up through the organisation?
So my reading of the Mazars report is that there were references to the purchase of Alexandra House, but they were part of an incidental report which wasn't really structured in the way that would allow anyone to form a view that actually we were seriously considering buying this asset.
Okay, that report is referenced here. And who saw the report?
So there isn't, that's my point. There isn't a report that's essentially what I'm calling a business case that sets out the merits of purchasing Alexandra House. Now, that would be the route by which anybody, chief executive or otherwise, would establish whether there was a proposal to purchase Alexandra House. I think what Mazars have seen is references which went to a strategic property board that it essentially highlight that if we purchased Alex House, we could save money on the medium-term financial strategy, or it could aid the accommodation strategy. It's not clear from that, though, whether that meant that Alex House was available to purchase or not. The references are very narrow and very vague.
Final question, Chair, and I appreciate you indulging me. Can you tell me who the members of the Strategic Property Board are, please?
I think that's set out in Appendix C of the paper.
Okay, I've got Councillor.
Page 12, sorry.
Sorry. Yep. Shall we move on, Councillor Amin? I think you had a question.
Mrs. Jani, I hope you can hear me. I struggle to hear you. I'm very sorry if you have to repeat yourself again. And I'm reading through it and recognising that it was a catalogue of failure. And it doesn't feel as if had this issue not been raised, that catalogue of failure would have ever come to light in some ways. So I think that in itself is quite worrying, really. And you mentioned the management changes that have taken place as a result of that. So and you mentioned some of them, and I just feel, how can we be sure as a committee those management changes, because this is all about management, and how can we be sure as a committee that these management changes have now taken place? Is there a way in which the committee would be informed of any further purchases, or is there a place that a local resident can go to find out what's being purchased, how it's going to be purchased, all of that information? Is that, that transparency, because it's not transparent, this has arisen because it's not transparent. So I just wondered whether there's a way of explaining how that will not happen in the future.
Thank you, Councillor Amin. I think that's the heart of what this committee is about. You are seeking assurances that the issues that arose from the Mazars' work, particularly the weaknesses and the failings that happened previously, can't be allowed to happen again. And I totally agree. And what should happen is that, having identified those issues, management should put in the right controls in place. So this is the management systems for making sure opportunities such as these and others are properly considered. And then I think you're looking at internal audit, people like me, to carry out a regular review to seek assurances that those systems are operating as they should. So with that in mind, we have an audit that is in the plan, and it has started, the findings of which I'll bring to you, which set out whether those assurances that we've had from management around the new systems are operating as well as they should.
Councillor Blake.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to make some observations. I need to be careful with my language. I think, look, all of us operate in political life, in public life. I think the problem with this report, and it's a problem I think we see in political life in this country, is that this report is focused on the priorities of the bureaucracy. when of course we've had an incident here where personal reputations are kind of put on the line, you know, in terms of the kind of external scrutiny and quite spurious observations that are made, whether it's on social media or wherever. And I think what I've struggled to get behind with this report, that it just feels very opaque in terms of what the priorities are. For me, I'm very clear about what the priorities are, and it needs to kind of clearly state in terms of who did what and who's responsible for what. And for me, it fails in doing that. And when we look at the issues in public life at the moment, whether it's MPs with second jobs who for different interests and then taking votes in Parliament around those interests that, in my view, kind of compromise those positions. I could go on and on and on. The kind of revolving door that we've seen at the top of public life that never used to exist 20 years ago in previous governments, right? These things matter. They matter about people's personal reputations. And I'd like much kind of greater clarity in terms of the report, in terms of who is responsible for what, right? And where the buck stops. That doesn't happen with this report. You're just left with lots of more and more questions, I'm afraid, and it adds to this kind of fudge that will be, you know, will just be a feeding fest for those kind of spurious claims that I've mentioned. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Blake. So I think that there's two very valid points that you raise. The first is around standards in public life and the no-limit principles. I totally agree with you that actually we would wish to uphold the highest standards, and the principles that Nolan has set out are inherent in what we do. So those values must be upheld and are upheld. The second point is around the process of the, I think you use the word bureaucracy. I think what this report does is it highlights that actually we may have been bureaucratic, but we weren't making sure that the key controls were in place for making sure that the decisions on whether we acquire Alex House or not acquire Alex House were in place. So what this report does is it essentially highlights, and I think you use sort of opaque as a phrase, what this report highlights is actually how difficult officers found it to come to a conclusion as to whether Alexandra House should have been purchased or not. The processes that were in place at the time were just not good enough to allow clarity in what it is that we intend to do. There should have been a very clear process for considering these assets. There should have been very clear audit trails. There should have been good communication with whoever was the decision maker. There should have been proper consideration of all the options that we wish to consider. Those should have been documented, finance comments obtained, the value of acquisition or not acquisition properly considered. That just didn't happen. That is why it's difficult to sort of get to a point where you think, well, what is it that should have happened and who's accountable? Well, accountability essentially rests with management on this. And the processes that we had in place at the time were not good enough to allow for that decision to be made as it should have been. And I should say, just Councillor Blake, from an audit point of view, it's not a concern for me as to whether we make the decision to purchase or not to purchase. It's the process that's important. Did we follow the right processes to come to a conclusion?
Thank you. Councillor Tabwa?
So what you're telling, my understanding from what you're saying is that the process failed, or was it a failure to follow the process? So because that would mean there's two different, well, possibly two different outcomes in that sense. So if the process failed, who is ultimately responsible to ensure that they have the correct processes?
Thank you for the question. Mazar's report essentially says that the process just wasn't strong enough, as in the process wasn't there in the first instance to allow the consideration to be made properly. So there should have been something that said, when these opportunities arise, there will be a proper business case. There isn't a process for that.
Could I just come back? So who would be responsible to ensure that that is the case, and who was responsible for that to be the case at that point?
So, for any process in the organisation, it's always management. So management are responsible for putting in place the right processes to make sure that they get the outcomes that they need. So it would be management in this case.
Thank you.
Management's a very broad word, so I'm just trying to sort of, is it a committee of the top 4 or 5 people in the council? I'm just trying to understand what you mean when you say management, because there are many levels of management.
So anyone who's responsible for making sure property transactions are dealt with properly in their job description. So there's not one person that's responsible for that. There are a whole host of people whose job is to make sure that these things are dealt with properly. So they would all put in the type of control system to make sure these things are considered properly.
Thanks. No further questions from members of the committee. Can I just ask a couple of points? In the Mazars report, paragraph 2.2, it says that their approach included interviews of key stakeholders. But over the page on paragraph 3.1, it would appear that they only interviewed one person. Can you just clarify how many people were interviewed by Mazars to assist them in writing this report?
Thank you, Chair. I think I'll need to go back to Mazars and ask that question. But as I understand it, I think it was predominantly the interim assistant director at the time. I think they would have spoken to other people in that service, but I'll need to check.
Can I just ask about the references to the Strategic Property Board? So in 4.2D, it says that the purchase of Alexandra House, they've seen 2 separate papers presented to the Strategic Property Board in December 2018. Yet on page 12 of the documents, where it gives a timeline, under December 2018, it also refers to a January Strategic Property Board. And the terms of reference of the Strategic Property Board states that it normally meets quarterly. So can you clarify, when did it meet during this period from, what is it, sort of November 2018 through to May 2019? How often did it meet, and is there any reason why we couldn't see the minutes of those meetings?
Thank you, Chair. The meeting, I think, was in December. And I think this is my earlier point about making sure that whatever report is presented at whatever forum, it's very clear what the report is trying to do. What Mazars have reported in their findings is that there appears to be incidental references to Alexandra House, but there's nothing particularly concrete that sets out what it is that is being proposed. It's almost like just a reference to Alexandra House, and that's pretty much it. So from an audit point of view, Mazars has rightly concluded that needs to be much more thorough and needs to be in a form that allows the committee or the meeting to be able to form a proper view on that. In terms of the availability for the papers, Chair, I think we'll have to ask that question through the formal channels. I couldn't comment on that.
Can I ask about paragraph 5.2? And it says that no obvious forum for consideration of such matters in terms of reference, and I believe you made that point in your introduction. But it seems to me there are 3 boards, we're given their terms of reference. It seems that the acquisition of a property is a relevant matter for all of those. 2 of them are officer-only boards, and the other one includes some political leadership. So I was puzzled why Mazars said there was no obvious forum. There seem to be a number of different forums. Can you clarify what they're getting at there?
Thank you, Chair. I think the point there is that when you've got an opportunity such as this, which cross-cuts across a number of different streams, it wasn't particularly clear which forum or which body was the right body to report this possibility to. So there are references to the Strategic Property Board. There is a later reference to the corporate, I think it's the corporate, just bear with me, Chair, the Corporate Property Board, which receives a paper much later than the Strategic Board about the fact that we will be needing to move from Halifax House from a point of view of staff. But actually, you would have expected that reference to have been much earlier, to have considered the full opportunity before the Strategic Property Board. And I think this is the reference that Mazars have made, that actually, what is the sequencing for that thinking in terms of the various boards before it goes to the before the matter is considered at the Strategic Property Board, and at that point, is that the right forum or does it need to go elsewhere? The process is just not very clear, and when talking to management, they weren't particularly clear about what the various boards were there to achieve and which board should receive the paper. So that's the reference there.
I'll come to you in a moment, Councillor Tebble. Can I just finish raising, which, so there's a reference to 2 emails which seem to favour the purchasing of Alex House. So there's one listed under February 2019, and then the final one on page 14 on the timeline is May 2019, email reference to acquisition as a live option. And yet it was only that month that it would appear that Workspace were informed that the council didn't wish to buy it. I mean, do we have any idea how that view changed so quickly within the course of a month? And in particular, also that the person who issued, who gave the verbal instruction, in paragraph 5.6, was also the same person who in paragraph 4.1 was favourable towards purchasing the property. It says, we note that that person was open to the suggestion to purchase Alexandra House. So, but it doesn't get to the bottom of how or why those views changed. Do we have any information about that?
So, in short, the audit trail just isn't strong enough. The audit trail around the thinking, and I think if you were to look in the timeline, you'd see many references to information being presented in one place or another. But the audit trail, in terms of what the intention was, is just too weak. It's not possible to work that out. I think it's fair to say that officers were neutral. I don't think there was a view one way or the other. But as different matters come to light, the audit trail, which would allow certainly the organisation to be able to go back and consider what the right decision was, just wasn't there.
Okay. Councillor Tabwa, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Look, I'm going to be honest. I'm listening to what you're saying and I'm really trying to take this in. But I've got this massive thing that I can't get off, and it's a full structure. Is this the first time the council has ever bought or purchased a building or something? Because by all accounts, by what you said, no one knew who to take it to, what committee to go to, at what time it should be said, and so forth and so forth. You had these 3 committees, you didn't know if you should be at this one or you should be at that one. What happened in the past? I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to be really candid. To me, it's obvious it was a failure to follow the procedures. And that is a bigger issue. Okay, and I think this report is trying to, in my humble opinion, whitewash that fact by saying that there were no procedures or the infrastructure was incorrect. That can't be the case. Haringey's not new. I've lived here for most of my life. I'm a 52-year-old man. Okay, it ain't the first time you sold somewhere or bought somewhere. So I think that you need to reconsider this, because the emphasis, in my opinion, is clearly on the wrong focus. Because you can put what infrastructure and processes you want, but if they're not being followed, then you're going to get that situation. And to me, it was just a plain case of processes aren't being followed, and somebody needs to be held responsible.
So that's an interesting observation, I'd say. Mazars are an independent firm of accountants. We employ them because they are independent from the council. They've carried out their work and they've reported what they've reported. This is not my report, this is a Mazars report. I think what the report shows is that clearly the organisation, Haringey, has purchased and sold assets. And incidentally, Mazars have done a piece of work on disposals of assets as well, where they've raised some concerns around how that process is being done. And that's been reported to this committee too. So from a council point of view, we are not as good as we should be in terms of acquisitions and disposals of assets. And we need to get better at that. The question I think you're asking is, was there a process in place that just wasn't followed? Or was there not a process at all? And I would say that from reading the Mazars report, there are elements where the process exists, but actually there's a whole lot of other elements where the process isn't very clear. And that is the bit which makes it tricky to know clearly what should have happened.
Can I just come back on that? Okay, I'm going to say I accept what you said, but I cannot understand how then you get to a situation where a certain level of staff are knocking around emails. At what point do you go to your superior and you say, this is the case? You see, I just still, irrespective there of what you just said, I'm not an office guy, I'm a bus guy, right? And at the end of the day, I know that if something is causing a problem, you go to your superior, okay? And you get a clarification, okay? And so I just still do not understand how educated people can't work that out. To me, it's mind-boggling.
Do you want to come back, Minesh? Yeah.
I would wish, from a head of audit point of view, I would wish the governance arrangements to be more robust. I would want to make sure that the internal controls environment are strong enough so that actually there is a proper way of considering such matters and for getting to the right decision at that time, whatever that right decision is. In this instance, that just didn't happen. And there's a whole host of things why that may be the case. And I think the Mazars report sort of points to quite a lot of those issues. And they're very wide issues.
Thanks. Councillor Ibrahim?
I suppose I'm going to make more of an observation than a question, but I suppose frame it as a question as well. Look, you know, my professional life is local authority, okay? So I understand how these things work, albeit at a far more junior level than the kind of structures that we're talking about here. The reality is, in local authorities, you need sign off to spend 50 pence. Do you know what I mean? And so it should be like that. You need sign off to order paper clips, to order paper. And I find it absolutely jaw-dropping, actually, that something of this scale could have ended up in a situation. Look, I recognise that there are situations where, you know, there are lots of different processes. There are things that cut across, and things fall between the cracks. That is the reality of local authorities as well. But at that level, and for those sums of money, or for, you know, if it's about making a decision not to do something, or and then deciding the next day to do something, there is a chain of command, there is a chain of authority, and I just find it deeply, and I think that's why, you know, it's quite hard for members to comprehend, because the reality is what people sometimes, and I don't agree with this actually, criticise local authorities for is what we call red tape or bureaucracy. But those things are designed to ensure that we never get into situations like this. And I'm glad to see you're nodding, because that's why I cannot bear the criticism that local authorities get for having clear structures in place, clear chains of command, because the reality is, Minesh, we are talking about public money, and where we make mistakes, it's at the detriment to services. And I think for me that, you know, what we learn from this is that we shouldn't, as councillors and as executive members, just assume that everything is in place, that we should always ask those questions, I think. And I think that's our duty, actually, to ask questions about, you know, where things can improve. Because a lot of the time, councillors can be, you know, I have the benefit of being from a local authority background and understanding how sometimes it can be frustrating, but a very, very kind of important process. But I suppose making sure that, because ultimately this is, you know, we're here as elected members, and, you know, we don't make those day-to-day decisions, those day-to-day operational decisions, but we have to make sure that we ask the right questions to make sure that when those day-to-day decisions are made, we are assured that they are done properly. And I'm not trying to, you know, place blame. I'm not a fan of, you know, because we have to take political leadership as well. I'm not a fan of trying to, you know, blame staff members for when things go wrong. I think ultimately it's important that we all take responsibility and make sure that we ask the right questions when those decisions are made, and not to be too critical and kind of angry sometimes when things are perceived to be too bureaucratic, because bureaucracy is very, very important in scenarios like this. That wasn't a question, it was an opinion, but thank you.
Do we take Councillor Blake?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the point in terms of Mazar's report. I mean, we've had years of, you know, look, I'm not trying to disparage them. I'm sure they're a perfectly reputable company, but the reality is we've had years of scandals with our big accountancy companies. You know, and again, I've come to the point that I made in my previous intervention, that the kind of relationship between the state and private firms, you know, you know, maybe I hark back. I'm an old timer, you know, but I hark back to the days of the district auditor, when you had a public official who would come in and look at the books and give an independent view. And I'm much more comfortable with that scenario, rather than an external firm coming in who maybe don't want to upset the apple cart, don't want to say things in the kind of sort of straight language that maybe needs to be heard, because they don't want to jeopardise kind of future business. Thank you.
Minesh, do you want to come back on those two contributions?
Sure. So, Councillor Beck, if I can give you some reassurance on that. Anybody carrying out internal audit work has to follow quite strict public sector internal audit standards. And I can't speak on behalf of Mazars, but I can't believe for 1 second any firm would stake their reputation for a report such as this. So I think what you've got is a view from Mazars as to an independent view of what they see are the key issues that led to the decision-making process around Alexandra House. And in terms of your point around district auditor and the audit commission as they were, we don't have the audit commission anymore, but we do have the external auditors, and that's our BDO, Ben Hamlin. They, as part of their accounts, carry out a review of our governance in the broader sense. And I know they've had a look at the acquisition of Alex House as part of that process.
Thank you. Have we concluded the discussion on the public part of this item? Yes. So in that case, item 13 is new items of urgent business, if we don't have any. Item 14 is to note the dates of future meetings, which are the 1st of February and the 10th of March 2022. So that brings us to item 15, which is the exclusion of the press and public. And we will be considering items 16 and 17, which contain exempt information. So we will be moving to exclude the press and public from the remainder of the meeting to consider the exempt information as defined in paragraphs 1, 2, 3 and 5, part 1, schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972. So is the exclusion of the press and public for these items agreed by members? If anyone has any comments or objections to this, can you please say so now? Okay, thank you. So I will, that is agreed. So that marks the end of the public section of the meeting. We will just pause while the recording is stopped and then restart with the exempt part as soon as we can.